So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what I call exploratory diagrams or exploratory diagramming. And I use this idea in distinction from a kind of a more kind of infographics, a more kind of informational type of diagramming, whether it's statistical or explanatory, which tends to be about representing pre-existing knowledge or pre-existing objects. Right, so I'm going to begin. What I'm going to talk about, what I'm going to show you is, I'll do this lecture really by going through some of my own work. My own work is related to, it's the production of art, and I use it a lot in art education as well, diagramming. But I'm just beginning with this image, these are kind of diagrams, the kind of diagrams I do all the time, which are not meant for public display. I'm just showing them as an example of the kind of use I put, which is very common. I see diagramming as a very democratic form of visual production. I think everyone does diagramming to some extent or other. So on the left I have, this is the kind of diagrams I do sometimes when I'm trying to write something or trying to think through some problems. So this one relates to, I guess, questions of the art world and the art economy in relation to the teaching of professional practice on fine art courses. And it's a sort of semiotic square, which is a very kind of productive machine for me to be able to kind of think through concepts. And on the right is, I've got loads of these, a kind of typical diagram I sketch up in my studio to try to figure out some kind of mechanism when I'm making kinetic sculpture, for example. So this is a kinetic rubber plant, which I'm currently engaged in. Okay, and this is kind of where it all began in terms of kind of identifying myself, or really somebody telling me that what I do is diagrams, in the sense that I started to get invited to things which had to do with diagramming. This is about 10 years ago, and a project I did called Metallurgy of the subject, which is one of the kind of big projects, kind of ongoing things, and it's taken different forms. This is really the second form that it took, which was a kind of live drawing talk, so I kind of draw and talk at the same time. So most of the diagramming I do, this is actually how I do it. I actually do it live, not like this, not like a kind of PowerPoint presentation, but there's a big difference, I think, between looking at a finished diagram and looking at the process of a diagram being drawn. It's a completely different kind of thinking process. So what you're getting is the kind of construction of something and the kind of construction of thoughts and kind of thinking processes. So it's a different form of attention, really. But metallurgy of the subject grew out of a kind of clash. It's a kind of, I see diagrams really fundamentally as a kind of synthesis of different things. It's a way that different things can kind of come together in interesting ways, not necessarily resolved ways, but ways that kind of bring up new thoughts, new ideas, and lead to new works, really. And so metallurgy of the subject came about by a coincidence of being asked to make something for an exhibition called Obsidiana, which had, I guess, a kind of esoteric theme, and being asked to write something for a journal on the theme of the community to come. So I was reading an essay called The Inoperative Community by Jean-Luc Nancy, which some of you might know. It's quite a difficult, dense text, and it's really his reconceptualization of ideas of communism and community. And then I was employing something I've always been interested in, which is a kind of alchemical language, and that alchemical visual language, a kind of very allegorical but also very diagrammatic visual language. I'm absolutely kind of fascinated by these images, which seem to have nothing to do with official histories of art as we know it, but seem so kind of rich and dense and mysterious and complex and open to kind of interpretation. And so I think one of the things I do with my own form of diagramming is bring together the diagrammatic, which I see as being fundamentally a kind of geometrical exercise, in the sense that you kind of lay things out spatially, you make them sensually intuitive. It's like putting something in front of you, particularly kind of abstract, complex concepts, in order that they can be put in relation with each other, and inferences can be made and so on. With a more kind of allegorical or emblematic language, which allows for other types of thinking to occur. So it's almost like the geometrical diagrammatic element is a kind of flat plane, and then the emblematic for me is they're almost like little holes which kind of draw you in to another dimension, maybe little wormholes or something like that, little caves. So the basic schema is, I'll do this very quickly. How do we move from a kind of privatized being at the top to something like a communal being, community at the bottom, without ending up with what Jean-Luc Nancy calls an essential being? How do we get to what he calls being in common? And I'm just about to write being in common at this point. And it's done through this is done through I've done it through a kind of allegory of sacrificial transmutation. So I use a lot of metaphor and so on. Okay, so this is a kind of simplified, I would say this is a more diagrammatic version of the previous image. And you can see some of those points more clearly. It leaves out certain things, but it draws more attention to other things in its clarity. And you can interpret or maybe recognize some of these figures, what they might be, where they might come from. Okay, so that's metallurgy of the subject. This is what I call social body mind mapping. And this started off very much in terms of education, in terms of running workshops, and originally been asked to run a workshop on something. And what I wanted to do, which is something I notice a lot, particularly teaching fine art undergraduate but also postgraduate students, is that there's a tendency when students talk about their work, and it might not only be students in this regard, but they talk about their work as if it comes directly from an idea that they've had. And often in crit situations or tutorials, what I hear being described in terms of the work seems to bear very little relation to what we're actually seeing in front of us. So how to kind of change a certain kind of framework, how to get a different view on something, and therefore to be able to think differently about it. What if we thought of the artwork as an alien object. Your own artwork is completely alien. It's something like a question mark. It's something which actually you don't know where it's come from. You're as kind of intrigued about this enigmatic thing as anyone else, which is sometimes how I experience the work I do. And I think a lot of artists don't exactly know where the work comes from. And so I think there's a level of within diagramming, there's a level of formalization, let's say, which is a kind of reduction, and then that leads to a kind of expansive moment. So there's a kind of reductive moment that leads to an expansive moment. So a kind of formal rigor, which then leads to something more kind of exploratory. So in this case, I was thinking about, well, what are the theories of art? I drew out some basic theories of art on the left. What's the origin of the artwork? This little drawing of the artwork there just happened to be a sculpture in this space. I don't know who it was by. It was by some student at Kingston. So I just drew it there. It was just on the left. I think that little pink thing is part of it. But it was a kind of weird object. So you then have a kind of something like a table or a very basic schema. How do we think about the artwork, not as originating from someone's head or from the institution or from the medium or from the world, but we begin with the artwork, okay, and then we think about what are the capacities, the resources, the motivations, the organizations that allow this thing to come into existence. So it doesn't come from the artist's head primarily. It comes from all these other places, and all these other places can be many and varied. And during the workshop situation, students can come up with their own list of things. And this is the example from this rubber plant sculpture of mine that I drew out as an example. Here are some, oh, it's working now, that's good. Here are some student examples. I think these are from Goldsmith's Foundation students. So these are done fairly quickly, and the process is really one of kind of intense reflection, I think. There's something particular that happens when you're drawing, a particular mode of reflecting on your work, and then the moment where you share that with other people and you can talk about it. So a lot of these diagrams are always made in relation to a moment of explication, a moment of speaking about them. They don't necessarily make that much sense, some of them. Some of them have a lot of words in them, some of them have less. But they're always about a kind of communicative process of sharing. And I think through sharing, the diagrams themselves become potentially alterable. They become always in a potential state where they can be then changed and take different form, be elaborated, be become the next stage, let's say, in a kind of process. I like diagrams because they seem to me that they are a stage in a kind of ongoing thinking process. So they're not autonomous in the sense that we might, or some people might speak about artworks as autonomous. So in that sense, they're less precious, they're more useful, but they're also potentially very aesthetic, symbolic, and everything else you'd want from a good artwork. So then this is one of my elaborations of the plant piece. So I do these things and then I kind of, at some point, might feel inclined or might be asked to do something, so I do a new version. This was made for a Riso print that was never made into a print, but it exists in this kind of digital state at the moment. And so these are some of the places I think this kind of kinetic rubber sculpture might come from. Now, how am I doing for time?
About 20 minutes, so another 10 minutes is fine.
Okay. So again, that chart on the left side, I'll just go back to it. The left side, the origin of art. This then becomes elaborate. I then elaborate this, slightly change the names of these different, I'd call them different theories, predominant theories of where the artwork comes from. I use different figures and so on. So this is how they develop. And the central schema for the social body mind maps, which was quite a kind of boring chart in a way, a kind of grid, a kind of table, a grid, I then elaborated into this, which is something much more aesthetic. So the artworks will reside in the middle, and then the various capacities, motivations, resources, and organizations are charted almost like some kind of natural formation. This was partly inspired by some old German maps of history. So maps of history are very interesting. If you're interested in the kind of history of diagramming, particularly the use of kind of natural metaphors. So there's a lot of trees. I mean, trees are very, very familiar in all kinds of diagrams. And he was using something that looked like kind of rivers. So there's a sense of here that I was trying to, I guess, get across, or somehow the work gets across for me now, looking at it, of something deep and powerful, some kind of force coming from underneath, or from the unconscious maybe, or from social forces that are powerful but we're not necessarily consciously aware of. Okay, can anyone guess what, there's 5 images here, can anyone guess what they're relating to? Yes, well done. So I do another kind of, it comes from teaching again, and it comes from more kind of theoretical teaching, running seminars at St. Martin's. And I started doing one on diagramming, and the first thing I'd get the students to do was, I'll tell them I'm going to give them a text and they're going to draw it. And I'm going to give them half an hour to draw it. And the text is Plato's Cave from the Republic. Very, very few students will have read it. Very few will even have heard of it. But they all do very good drawings. What's incredible for me is the kind of confidence that a lot of, particularly art students, are some of them, as some of you will know, they're very resistant to the kind of, difficult critical theory that they're given to read. But something like drawing comes much more easily, even though having to draw something that you read necessarily means a very intense, close reading of something. It really does, and a kind of rereading of something. So having to draw something means that you really have to read something closely and try to understand it. But I'm interested in how all the drawings are different, and they use different kind of modes. Some of them are kind of narrative, some of them are much more abstract, some of them are more kind of realism. I've got hundreds and hundreds of, not hundreds and hundreds, I'm exaggerating. I've got over 100 Plato's Caves. I call them Plato's Caves, And then suddenly I have some idea, okay, I'll put them all together for one class, so that there's about 25 students' drawings here. Because the whole point about doing Plato's caves is Plato uses an allegory really as a way to talk about how he's against representation, which is kind of ironic. So, you know, the more you kind of try to represent something, the further away you're getting from the truth. So I like this idea. I like this idea that kind of art making, representation might be really a creation of these new worlds, which are, you know, I think of it like the philosopher who steps out of the cave and sees the truth of the sun is actually mistaken. They've actually just stepped into a new cave. It just happens to be their cave, and they imagine it's the sun. So there's a close-up, and you can see some of these great drawings. And I've done it for the last 2 years with students from the Institute of Education, a lot of them are teachers. These classes are done in the evening, which gave me a nice opportunity. I get them to draw it, and then they draw it on the wall, and then we turn the lights off, and it's dark, and I go around with a torch. So it's more like a kind of in the cave, and then they each describe what their interpretation is, what their image means. I did this recently with some of the PhD students at Kingston in relation to Catherine Hale's first chapter of Catherine Hale's new book, which is called The Cognitive Non-Conscious. So these are some of the examples, some great drawings. And again, everyone talks about them. And an example of the kind of diagram I hate, which is the one that's in the chapter in Catherine Hale's actual book. I mean, it serves a basic function, but it's so generic. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, the reason why this thing is the shadow is some kind of metallic thing. So I think these are much nicer, and I think writers should incorporate more of this kind of diagramming in their texts. There's a much richer way into. I saw Catherine Hale's just a couple of weeks ago at the ICA, and she, I chatted to her briefly, and I sent her these diagrams. But she talked about dwelling in the concept, which is an idea I like. But I think you can dwell in the concept with a diagram of this type, but not with this type. There's no room for dwelling here. You're just confronted with this kind of thing that you can't do anything with materially. Okay, another thing which kind of comes out of the Metallurgy project, but here I'm not mapping kind of subject positions as much as state forms. So this is called diagramming politics, and I'm trying to chart conservative, neoliberal and welfare state forms in relation to this basic kind of pyramid of power, security and freedom. And this really came out of, I guess, the Brexit Trump moment and everything that's happening in terms of returns to kind of authoritarian modes of kind of populism and so on. And again, what diagrams allow, I think, what they allow for me is to make certain inferences. And so you chart something like this, and then new relations almost kind of form. So they are machines to allow you to think. I mean, certainly that's how I think of them. And this is something I did. I just did this just over a week ago, a gallery called Space Gallery, where the group that Jeff mentioned, the Social Morphologies Research Unit, which is a group of artists and anthropologists who we all use diagramming, have been working together, and we now have this exhibition on. This is the work I do with the Capital Drawing Group. So we are drawing or diagramming or illustrating Marx's Capital, Volume 1. So I've been focusing very much on the first part of Capital, Volume 1, which is about commodities and money, which is the most abstract point. And of course, again, this is all about representation, because what is money? I don't know, Mara, maybe you'll talk about this, but maybe not. But, you know, money in a sense is a kind of representation of something else, right? Maybe a number of other things, but one of them being labour time, or what Marx would call socially necessary labour time. So, you know, again, this is not, probably for me, it's not primarily about trying to explain something to someone. It's very much about me trying to understand something. And I do all kinds of sketches, and then I end up in a kind of stage where maybe I'm happy to show them to people. On the left is so these are examples of the way I might show. I have shown these in an art exhibition. These are risograph prints. Diagram of Walter Benjamin on the left, which was originally made for a book called The Lost Diagrams of Walter Benjamin, which has about 50 diagrams by various people. And on the right, a diagram of really kind of coming from Beyond the Pleasure Principle by Freud, which is another text I've asked students to draw. Again, a very kind of complicated, speculative text, and they make brilliant texts for diagramming. I'm going to just end with a couple of images. Again, these are images which are not, I wouldn't show, but they're kind of my thinking through of some of the stuff you've seen, which then becomes stuff that might become public in some kind of way. So this is a couple of sketchbook pages of diagramming politics, the diagramming politics piece, so you kind of get an idea how I'm kind of thinking about how these things might go together, which terms to use, which ones I then discard, the kind of emblems I might use, and so on. And some of my notes trying to do the same thing for Marx's Capital. That's it. Okay, thank you very much.
What I'm going to present is the stage of my PhD research project that I've been conducting more consistently since 2015-16, but that is a sort of culmination of 10 years of reflections about the way how the art system and basically contemporary art gets in tensions with, in a particular tension with the art institutional world in general, but more specifically how it is linked also to its wider existence, or I would say paradoxical existence within the creative and cultural industries. Now, the structure of this talk would be, oh no, I'll have to go back. So I would try now just to outline very quickly that I'm using this diagramming practice basically as a practice of annotation that permits a sort of direct relationship with what I'm thinking while I'm trying to understand the complex relationship that somehow shaped the world of contemporary art institutions and educational platforms, and how are they somehow exercising a particular pressure on critical practice and critical thinking approaches within the same art system, meant in the large sense. Now, the working title of what I'm what my PhD research would be right now. It's called interactive comfort. I'll try. I hope we'll have time that we will arrive at the very end of these slides. So interactive comfort, contemporary art and art institutional playgrounds in enrichment/financial economy. The structure will be, I'll just try to outline a couple of artists that have been some sort of an inspiration for what I've been doing in the past years. I'll then do it I'll try to go through what exactly is the field of research that I'm trying to investigate. Then we'll try to make a focus on what is this industrial pressure or contemporary art that I'm talking about. Try to go into what are the general problems that I've been encountering in these past 2 years in defining these things that I've been just describing. I'll look at these specific problems or at hegemonic circles that are defining the sector. I'll try to make a sort of digression into the concept of comfort interaction, and I'll try at the very end to go into the methods and timeline, and in general in these tools and data sets that I've been designing that are also leading me towards a new experimental project that has been designed also with data scientists and that are somehow helping me to construct an algorithm that will make a scientific, or that will provide a scientific background to the mess that I might share right now with you through these diagrams. So this I might just made a list of those artists that will be, and then of course it's missing, but there are other artists that are missing in this list, but it's Mark Lombardi, Hans Hacke, Andrea Fraser, Jack Burnham, Bureau-d'études, Situationist International, Marcel Brodes, which Jeff mentioned before, which is a major project, research project I've been working on, and that just to reconnect to the concept of money and the symbols of power have been massively important for my research project in terms of shaping what is actually the need, which could be the contemporary need of an institutional critique approach nowadays. But this should be another lesson, lecture. So Mark Lombardi, I'm just going to go through these diagrams very quickly because it's not an art history lecture. So in any case, if you would need any references later on, I will be happy to share. So these are I don't know how much you are in Mark Lombardi's, you are aware of Mark Lombardi's practice, but his research was basically investigating stories that have been shaping the relationship between corporate and governmental bodies, illicit organization and crime groups, and he was active in the 70s. He would call them narrative structures. Just to go through that very quickly, those are all images that I've found in a very interesting exhibition in New York last year. Hans Hacke's practice, which you probably know, but for example, his project on Manhattan real estate buildings, again from the 70s, was of extreme importance, and I find it extremely relevant also for the way how artists eventually should be putting in place something that Adorno would call a negative tension with the present moment, which would define as well artistic commitment and would put it in a sort of antagonism or opposite. It would work as an opposite concept of artistic engagement. We don't have time, but this would be a very important, let's say, set of concepts that I would very warmly, suggest you to investigate in terms of whatever critical tools might mean, including diagramming for artistic expression. So I don't know how much you're into this project, but yes, he would be working in 1971 on locating all the investments in property holdings at the time and the way how that was basically shaping also the politics of that time's Guggenheim Museum's cultural policies, and he was tracing real-time social systems in New York by looking at demographics and trying to find the role of art and see how this is entangled with socio-political issues, and he would be doing it with an extremely consistent forensic attitude that would, of course, as well be very important for the artists that we have seen before, Lombardi. So this is how it looks like, but because of this project, the curator of the Guggenheim at the time lost his job. So, I mean, it's a very interesting story, but it's not the moment now. So, this is another artist that I didn't know, Falstrom, but I've found it very interesting for those, for example, that are like trying to, use this mapping and more sort of poetic, or maybe, trying to, I don't know, maybe depict human suffering in relationship to the effects of corporate power or corporations. Then very recently, I don't know how much you're into Andrea Fraser's work, she's of course meant to be one of these representatives of institutional critique, but his later work in Museums, Money and Politics was for me extremely important for my research as well, because she decided to systematically structure and label exactly the power relations that she would encounter within the boards of American museums, in order to demonstrate that what is happening in the United States in terms of the institutional and art system in general can be compared to a plutocratic way of organizing society through money and so on. So she went to tax offices, and she has made this massive research, also looking to researching whether the board members of these museums in states were Democrats or Republicans, and to which extent they have been influencing the way how museums would be investing their money in artists and their practices. But I mean, I would just recommend in any case to see, because it is a particular way of imagining diagramming through infographics that is settled into sets of data which are not invented, they are not interferential. It means they are not driven from a small sample and they are generalizing what's happening, but she went and she did a consistent systematization of what is actually, let's say, information at reach, but it of course takes enormous amounts of time to organize and analyze. So just very on then, Burhan and so on. Jack Burhan, that was an art critic trained as an artist, that recently died, and especially his work, for example, on systems aesthetics, which was at the time in the 70s extremely important, because he tried to demolish the concept, or actually the system of work, of the way how aesthetics would enter into the world of making the art system, and that also cost. I mean, he paid this sort of analytical and very critical approach with a sort of imposed isolation by a group of art historians. So it's another story that would be nice to look at. So what's the time? Because that was supposed to be very short, but I'm not that quick today.
Oh, it's okay. It's only been about 10 minutes.
I have another 10 minutes.
15.
Okay, good. So what I'm doing in my research, so it somehow drives from those 3-4 examples that, but I mean, I've discovered them by the time I was doing my research, so it was not the other way around. So what I'm looking at are these new relationship and tensions that have been emerging in this past 20 years. Specifically, I'm looking what was happening since 2003/2008 and how the new creative and cultural economy has been shaping the field of institutional critique, critical theory, and exhibition studies. That I mean that I've been looking at how the instrumentalization as well of critical thinking has been in a way which is the place and the way how critical thinking has been instrumentalized within the wider, the larger sector of the creative and cultural economy, of which the art system is a consistent part. By creative industries and creative cultural economy, I hope that we somehow agree. We will not be able now to enter into what cultural industry was from the 60s onwards and which stage we are, but we might eventually assume that we are talking about a moment where the creative sector, including the art sector, is facing very huge and deep similarities with the sector of communication, advertising, and eventually larger television and entertainment sector, to the extent they might be compared, or eventually they became comparable constituencies. In more general, let me see where it is. The more general problems that I've been looking at from the perspective of this instrumentalization is how critical thinking, institutional critique, and exhibition studies, I mean, this sort of critical engagement with what, a critical approach to what the art world system, the art world and the art world system looks like. Is and how it is, how it circulates within a very specific triangulation of instances. What I've been looking is how, for example, biennials, so global, I'm referring to global institutional playgrounds. In that general umbrella term, I would define or at least list 3 of those dimensions. One would be perennials, which means exhibitions that will happen or occur every couple of years, biennials and triennials, and would in some sort of moment be projections of art on a global line, on an international scale, where this global exchange, but they would be basically used as platforms that can somehow facilitate the floodgates, economical and financial floodgates. Will not go. I cannot enter in details of how money and this financial part it is. It is a theoretical part of the thesis, which would need an hour by its own. But I'm looking at how biennials are interconnected then with museums and local institutions. I'm looking at public institutions. I will explain later why. And I've been at the beginning also looking at how is this linked also to the field of art education and in general on educational platforms, artistic educational platforms. And the way how people and social capital is circulating with the frame of this triangulation with a more specific, with a more specific focus than between the way how I started to more specifically look at how biennials. I think I missed one. slide. Where is it? We did it, but there's no. Okay, we missed the industrial pressure one. It's not problem. Okay, it's okay. So I've been looking at how this industrial pressure, that I call it industrial, I mean here the whole way of seeing and trying to understand that art is just a little chain within a larger industrial reframing of labor and production within the so-called developed world, but as well in the so-called global south. So even these two, the dynamics between the global north and the global south, or between the economic groups defined like OECD and non-OECD countries, it's very interesting when it comes to frame the relationship between the space that is provided by biennials, art biennials, and the way how this is reflected in terms of programming, cultural programming, and even exhibitions and decisions in terms of topics and contents that have been proliferating public art institutions in the past 20 years, and the patterns that are emerging that are linked, of course, to the circulation of a particular group of people that can be framed and, of course, listed and they can be there must be there is a process of individuation that can be put in place in order to understand exactly what was happening. So these are just general considerations which we will see later on. I tried after also to systematize through a different methodology. So I've been looking not at which are the artists that have been circulating among these two realities, not because I'm not interested in artists, no. I mean, that is basically, that's why I'm doing this research, is because the focus that I've put is on how curators and artistic directors have been circulating among them, and the way how they've been working in these instances in the past 15 to 20 years. Then the interesting thing is that in terms of rhetorics and aims and even implementation of larger, because I'm so sorry, I missed one slide here about this industrial pressure, but it's because, I mean, the way how this cultural industrial reasoning has been influencing the way how they've been working has progressively also in a way affected the rhetoric, which became a sort of rhetoric that can be labeled as neo-colonial progressive rhetoric that you will see if you would start following and reading press releases consistently, speaks of an ideology of progressiveness in terms of sustainability and change. And this kind of, let's say, this kind of affirmative claims that biennials and public institutions have embraced in the past 20 years are, of course, problematic, but what is most, I would say the biggest problem of all is that in these processes we've been facing a sort of or we can see or look at the process of dispossession that is occurring in terms of time, but also in terms of topics and means, and even in terms of critic, which is not able to, in a way, to interact with what is happening on a larger scale. So what basically, and how much do I have in terms of time?
How much do you need?
I don't know, we have 7 slides, because the last part is very quick. So what is basically happening is that even though these emerging ideas that have been largely part of this sort of, I would say, neo-colonial progressive rhetoric, which would mean, of course, that all of those humanist values like social engagement, criticality, social change, solidarity, whatever. I mean, the whole set of those claims, that we would encounter, even like ecology or sustainability, as I've just mentioned. We just look at all of those claims. They would be pushed to a moment of emergency, claiming about some sort of horizontality of institutional action, but at a certain moment, from the underground, the emergency of those projects that could be even led by artist-led, or it can be some sort of, grassroots communities, including, the commoning projects and so on, which are extremely, they're almost a tendency nowadays. They would arrive to a moment of meet in the mid-scale of this pyramid, in this mid-network space, where biennials and institutions would use them in order to, or use them, they would just invite them to be also part of their programs, but they would never, ever be able to interact with a reality that goes beyond this protected reality that is provided by those platforms. Like biennials, triennials, and institutions as such. There is a sort of logic that is overall governing this space that determines the way how these behaviors between this middle part of this pyramid is occurring. So at the very top, we see that there are, as we know, this is a classic pyramidal institutional structures which we know since centuries. But within spaces of comfort interaction that are provided by these platforms, a sort of stage horizontality has been, in a certain sense, promoted. Yeah. Now, this self-organizational trend, has been quite present, and we have been, in terms of frequencies, really assisting to a whole renaissance of community art and public art since at least the beginning of 2000, if I would not say, in this sort of moment that arrived in this post-globalization time, and of course in times of post-everything. So this comfort interaction space where this sort of hyperactive interactions, new ecological ideology, socially engaged spirits, anti-liberalist attitudes, and critical radicality has been occurring has been de facto staged within controlled borders, because every time artists would try, or projects would try to go beyond, as it was, for example, already in the case of Hake in the 70s, this impact on the external world would be blocked or marginalized. Now, this is, of course, very problematic, because it looks like that artists are limited to sort of being used as visionaries and potentially emancipatory agents, but they are agents of such emancipation only within this controlled space of, or control zone of comfort interaction, where, of course, everything is tolerated. So I will not go into this and so on and so forth. Now, what is that I've been looking at specifically, which I was talking before? because I couldn't go back in the 70s. It's not, this is not, the point is to do a scan and to understand, and I'm trying still to understand what exactly happened to the art system in the past 10 years / 15. So I've been looking at, from 2000 to 2018, in terms of what was happening in the art world, of what happened in from 2002 from Documenta, curated by Okri and Zever. Of course, we have then case studies of exhibitions where these things are approached in a more detailed way. 2003 Bologna process reform, which set, the new beginnings of the industrialization of knowledge and cognitive practice, including critical thinking and so on. 2008's financial crack, that also then coincides with the UNCTAD report, which is a report that sets the way how investments in culture will be set from 2008 onwards, and that in a way frames completely a complete new action and investment strategy, and even imposes changes within the managerial language of institutions as such within the economic organization of developed countries. But that has, of course, an impact as well on countries in development. And that's why this financial and enrichment economy comes into play, which defines the way how the creative and art sector has been, like, in a way, reshaped, and which is also connected with the new reach, the moment where art has become a sort of space of investment for the economies, for the money makers, the new reach.
It's a very simple question.
UNCTAD report, United Nations Community something yes.
And it's Bologna reform, is that?
That's the educational reform. It is the reform signed in Bologna, but is the white paper for the reformation of European education. Yeah. So it's switching towards the industry. the more I would say they call it Chicago-style educational system, which is what we are looking and which is what we are living right now. That of course implies a sort of lifelong learning process of educational improvement, which means that if you arrive to gain a knowledge, you're never good enough. You have to continue with your education, possibly till the day you die. So this is what I've been looking at, then cuts in social spendings in EU from 2014 to nowadays, and how this magically corresponds with, a 40 in increase of the money within the cultural sector of 400% in the past 4 years. So I'm looking at this kind of paradox. Now I'm using diagrams because it's easier to explain what I'm doing, and I will have now 3 minutes, and then this is okay. I'm not going to go just very quickly. The research that I'm doing, it's a mix. It's qualitative and quantitative, which means that I've started with a very classic critical thinking and cultural and analytical approach, but then I've realized that if I will not, I cannot go into this detail here, but this is the point of money and profit and enrichment that could have been of some interest also in terms of how the money making gets entangled within the production of these new spaces of comfort and interaction, but it could be, tackled later. But this is why I've then started to do what? And I've been doing it and then realized that Andrea Fraser in the States was doing something not very similar, but she tried to systematize the information about museums board and their activity. And that she looked at private people and their interaction within the world of art. So I've never thought of doing it massively around, to do an international research thing, but what I started to do is that this is the interface that I call chronography of power, which is what we have just went through through the diagrams, but it's systematized in looking only at institutions and biennials. This is an algorithm that has been implemented through dataset. We've been looking at things happening from 2008, so just in order to sort of frame the 10 years of development. It counts words, it can count certain parameters. It's a sort of software that people would use. I mean, basically, it's a tool that I designed together with a data scientist because I really wanted to make sure that this can be implemented further on as a tool to understand what is happening in the institutional playgrounds, on the institutional playgrounds level, but not just in a sort of scan, as a sort of coronagraph that permits and leads you to understand, eventually check, or just research what has been the tendency between institutional programs, public museum, and basically public programs and exhibition programs within a certain number and sets of institutions. So as I said, there are public institutions. I'm looking at European institutions of contemporary art, and eventually those of contemporary art that have been operative or maybe even established after 2000. And there are, of course, certain content and theoretical arguments for that. So this is like how it comes out, and then these are parts of bits of what you can use and so on. But just to make sure and clear that there is a consistent work on database Excels. This is, for example, the list that had been like a systematization of 287 biennials. Their programs since 2008 onwards. These are just calculations which are not yet statistics, but they will be used to present and be part together with diagrams as numbers in infographics. I've been doing that because there is no information about what has been happening in the art institutional world in terms of numbers and, I mean, consistent information about for example, curators and so on. I mean, there are more than 1,000, so we're just looking at one very little bit of this Excel. Altogether, the Excel on biennials has 55,000 cells. 55,000 cells. So they are, of course, this is just a screenshot of even not 1/5 of this Excel. Just, to give you, I mean, an idea. But what is the final stage of this part of diagramming, connected also to, like I would say, network analysis approach, which of course it has its limits, but it's on the other side very helpful because it can ground this kind of research in a more scientific way, is this social network mapping, where I will try to present this chronography of power of the social capital that has been in a way or in another inhabiting these poles, these very institutional poles of the art system. So I would close it here, and I hope it was more or less, interesting. Yeah. Thank you very much.